So good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure and my honor to be moderating this second panel this morning. We're going to be addressing the question that Christian de Boissieu raised in his introductory remarks. And I think Christian put it perfectly, so I will just follow his recommendation. I think the three questions we have for this panel is why should we regulate ICOs? How should we regulate ICOs? And where should we regulate ICOs? So very simply, this is the objective of this panel. If you allow me, I will set the stage before we get into asking questions to our excellent roundtable. ICOs, we've seen the numbers in the preceding roundtable, represent now a very, very, very significant amount of capital raised. Therefore, they are not negligible anymore. Therefore, we must look into what should be done. I've even seen numbers, but it doesn't matter because it changes every day, that were higher than the ones presented in the precedent panel. But whether we're talking about $6, $7, or $10 billion raised last year, this is significant enough to be regulated. We all saw in the press, I think it was 2 days ago, that Block One just concluded a one-year IPO that raised $4 billion and even more than that. So, okay, big numbers by anybody's standards. I also read, to set the stage, a recent piece of research done by Morgan Stanley that said that 64% of ICOs either did not meet their funding target or failed in 2017. It's not me speaking, it's not the AMF, but it's a serious analyst who said so. So regardless of whether the number is accurate enough, we have something very significant to address. Another dimension that is very important to bear in mind when we're going to be addressing the why, the how, and the where we should regulate is that only a portion of ICO funds are raised in fiat currency, in fiat money, in hard cash, to speak in more trivial manner. So that's a very important dimension to bear in mind. Probably about 40%, if I read correctly what I've seen in a number of studies. I think Giancarlo Giudici said something in his presentation that was really important, and that should be addressed by this panel as well. He said that, and I'm quoting you, or what came out of your study, is that 80% of the tokens issued, or 79.9% of the tokens issued through ICOs last year, basically gave access to platform services. So basically, this means that ICOs, 80% of ICOs come to selling services before they exist. And this raises many, many questions, but certainly for regulators, it raises the question of the fair value of those tokens. In my limited understanding of economics and finance, I don't think anybody knows how to put a price on a future service that in many, many cases does not even exist. And that raises an issue for regulators because regulators obviously have an obligation to check that there is no misrepresentation of what's being sold. That's one thing. But they also have a mission of making sure that it's broadly fair and that we're bringing to market something, I don't dare calling it a financial product, that is selling more or less at fair value. We all know that fair value is not an exact science, but we need to assess what that is worth. And I think that is very important for regulators. We've seen regulators in the world take very, very different approaches to ICOs. We've seen SEC saying that depending on the cases, they will regulate or not. We've seen SEC also launch a fake ICO website called Hoi Coins. I mean, have a look at it. It looks terrific, but it's completely fake. You read it and you just want to subscribe, and then you realize that you've just been flawed. Okay, interesting. We've seen China and South Korea forbid it altogether. So the two questions for the regulators on this panel will really be, not only where should we regulate, but also what do we Europeans should do about regulating ICOs, and does it make any sense to regulate something locally in this global world and with a technology that seems to know very little borders. With us this morning, we have an excellent panel. We have two regulators. We have Lars van de Ven, who's a Senior Supervision Officer, Innovation and FinTech Team at the Dutch Authority of Financial Market. And we also have Benoît Juvigny, who's the Secretary General of Autorité des Marchés Financiers. So many questions for these two. We have the representative of a very large bank, Philippe Olivier Rousseau, who will give us the view of a major financial player on this topic. And last but not least, we have the CEO and co-founder of iExec, who's a startup who actually realized an ICO over a year ago. And it's really important to listen to the real experience. So if you allow me, I will start by asking Gilles Fedac to share his experience with us, to tell us where he's coming from, what he did, why he realized an IPO. And obviously my questions behind this general presentation will be, what was the purpose of doing an ICO? Was it for funding? Was it for something else? And was it an alternative for iExec to an IPO, to venture capital? I mean, what's your experience of that? I think it would be very interesting before we get into the regulatory debate.
So thank you very much for the introduction and also for this invitation. I am very honored to be here. We created this company called iExec in October 2016. Before that, I was a researcher at INRIA. It's the Institute for the National Institute for Research in Computer Science in France. And I was researcher here in parallel and distributed computing. So we created iExec, and the goal, just to give you an idea of what we are doing, and this will hopefully explain why we did an ICO and what's the advantage of an ICO also with respect to the technology. So at iExec, we are trying to decentralize the cloud. Decentralize the cloud, it means that, so if you know cloud computing, it's the infrastructure, it's the infrastructure that websites are using, main applications are using. And the goal is to create a marketplace, so you can think it as a sort of Airbnb for servers, but without Airbnb. Here, the idea is that using blockchain technology, people can interact in a peer-to-peer fashion. That's how we call it. And so this basically is only feasible using blockchain technology. So when we started this project about 3 years ago now, we went to this blockchain technology and to this crypto economy, firstly, due to the technological aspect. It was basically the idea that thanks to blockchain and thanks to tokens and crypto economy, we can now design new form of algorithms that were just undoable before. And so let me explain that in a few sentences. So when doing an ICO, the principle is very simple. We're going to create a new token or a new coin. So I call usually coin when you create a new blockchain, and a token when you create a new token on an existing blockchain. Creating a new blockchain is very complex. Very few people are able to do that. Creating a token on an existing blockchain, such as Ethereum, is very simple, and that's a matter of minutes. So creating a new token, it's two things. It's first creating a technology, if it's associated with a technology, and also creating a market. Or if it's not a market, it's at least a business model. So in our case, for instance, the technology, it's about distributed computing. Okay, so we manage all this network of machines. They are going to work together, and they can work together because there is a new technology, a new protocol. That's what we call a consensus protocol. And this consensus protocol is built using the tokens. Without the tokens, we cannot build the protocol, the consensus protocol, and we cannot build the technology. So that's the first reason why we need a new token. The second reason, I mean, to make this token successful at the time of the crowd sale, we must give it a business model. So with each token, you have a business model which is associated. So in our case, because we are building a network, we are building a marketplace, what we did is that we issued a fixed number of tokens, and we sold them at once. And no more tokens will ever be issued later, which means that if the network is successful, if it grows, if a lot of people are using this marketplace, there will be a sort of a pressure of the token, and this will increase the valuation of the token. And when doing an ICO, you must give this economic model. How to do an ICO? So when doing an ICO, we basically do 3 operations at once. It's a little bit like doing crowdfunding operation in the sense that we have to build a community, we have to involve many people in this crowdfunding operation because we receive the money before doing the actual technology, so it will be like subscription somehow. We're also doing like a traditional tour. I mean, we're trying to find, I forgot the name for that, but when you go and see several investment funds, a roadshow, I was searching the name. So it's also like doing a traditional roadshow. We try to find some funds. People were able to put significant money during the ICO. And at the same time, we're also doing a sort of IPO in the sense that we must convince people who are going to participate to the ICO that very soon after the ICO, the tokens will be listed in the second market, and people can trade the token and eventually maybe make money on that. So in our case, we did this ICO about a year ago in April 2016. At that time, it was the 5th largest one historically. We received the equivalent, so we emitted 87 million tokens called RSC, and we received the equivalent of 10,000 bitcoins. That was about $12 billion at that time, and we did that in less than 3 hours. But because, of course, there was significant work before the ICO. The ICO is really the moment where it happens. And technically speaking, it's interesting because everything was managed through a smart contract deployed on the blockchain. So all the terms of the ICO are transparent and can't be modified. I mean, the terms of the ICO, number of tokens, price, duration of the crowd sale, this is all hard-coded in a smart contract. And once the smart contract is deployed on the blockchain, nobody can change that, which from the perspective of the one who developed this smart contract, was my case actually, is also very difficult to manage because if everything goes wrong, it can go really wrong. You can't fix the code that has been deployed in the blockchain.
If we may go one step further, was this for you an alternative to doing an IPO, to raising venture capital? And the related question is, how did you go about deciding that your 87 million tokens were worth 10,000 bitcoins and not 1,000 bitcoins or 100,000 bitcoins? What was the thinking process? How did you decide on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So when doing this ICO, you must fix the term of the sale. And so usually we set what we call the min cap and the max cap. Min cap, it's basically according to my roadmap. So my roadmap was for 4 years. And basically it says, under this level of funding, I won't be able to do anything relevant. And the max cap, it's more something related to the market. So somehow the max cap, it's more, I let the market decide somehow. It's a little bit beyond what you need. So at that time it was $12 million. I guess that now ICOs have max cap, which are much more than that. At that time, so it was 1 year ago, so I'm sorry, it sounds a little bit like a prehistoric. At one year ago, $12 million, it was the 5th largest one. I guess that now you would probably need $1 billion to be amongst the top 5. So nobody needs $4 billion to develop a project. You need $4 billion to create a market, maybe. I don't know. I have no answer for that.
And the last bit was, if you hadn't done that ICO, would you have raised money in a more traditional way, or was it not the question?
Honestly, I never really thought about that. The question for us was, we do need to create a cryptocurrency, and we do need to give a value to this cryptocurrency, to this token. Without a value, the protocol just does not work, because we can't create the incentives that will make this protocol work. Okay. And the easiest way to give a value to this token is just to sell it. There are probably some alternatives, but they are certainly more complex than this one. And okay. Plus, it gives us money. So.
Very interesting. So the objective of creating community and users really, of your services was essential. Yeah.
That was really important, but really the idea is that without giving any value to this token, you can't design the protocol.
Understood. Mr. Rousseau, what's the... So, Mr. Rousseau, you represent BNP Paribas here, so a very large and established financial institutions. What's the view of the very important established financial institutions on those new ways of raising money and organizing new markets?
Thank you. So to say, we could say it could be the view of an incumbent facing new entrants. I've known that. I'm myself a telecommunication engineer, so that's all stories for me. And I would say with no surprise that our view is mainly positive, but to a certain extent cautious. We think that this transaction, and which once again are very complex and diverse, will develop, even though, as I said, they are very diverse, and I'll come back to that in terms of products, in terms of emitters, and in terms of investors. And basically, ICOs and tokens could be financial or non-financial, so that's a basic difference. And also because, or although there are some current lack of regulation, which might incidentally create some issues, in particular with two respects. One, with respect to investors' protection, and two, with respect to, and this has been said in the previous panel, but that's obviously pretty important, generally speaking, and in particular for banks and financial institutions, with everything that relates to anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism financing. So we could first ask quickly, why will ICO will develop? One, because they could be seen, at least today, as a potential complement to the existing either market financing or bank financing. Today, it could be seen as crowdfunding, crowdlending as a complement. Maybe one day it will be a third source of financing, aside from markets and banks. Two, because they allow a global reach and maybe to reach new investors. And just as an example, we have, as clients, large corporates, international corporates, who come, meet with our equity capital markets team, and say, what are you doing? What do you think of ICO? What are you doing? And then we ask them the question, you are large, you're listed, you can send any debt capital market product you want. Why are you interested in ICO? And they are basically interested in ICO for two reasons. One, which is legitimate, because it's new and they just want to test the water. Two, because they think they could reach new ranges, new groups of investors on a global level, which could not be reached if they are doing a capital increase or if they are emitting some new bonds. Third reason why it will develop quickly, because it's quick and because, as said before, at least at the moment, we'll discuss that eventually, there is no specific regulatory framework. So that makes things quicker and easy. And then for last but not the least, because if I'll come back to the various types of assets eventually. But when it comes to security or asset-based tokens, that means that if you are close to something which looks like equity, and Gilles was very clear in terms of how this could interconnect with a secondary market, which could be both a secondary token market, but also a secondary market in a traditional equity view, shares view, and basically because at that point it's non-dilutive in terms of equity. So this could be also seen as an advantage. Quickly, two other points. One is, as I said in introduction, there is today a wide diversity of products. There is basically 4 types of tokens, as have been established, among others, by the Swiss Central Bank, which are basically one, utility tokens. In French, we would say des tokens ou des coins d'usage, which correspond to a service. 2, asset-based tokens. 3, security tokens, which are not very far from securities, and which possibly, but not necessarily, could have voting rights, could have rights to get dividends, maybe, maybe not. And then things which exist, even though we don't like that, which are cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and so on. And in our view, that means that because the range is so wide, because there are such a diversity in tokens and in coins, tokens are not necessarily coins, but once again, interconnection, we believe that there should not be a single legal qualification, characterization. And we also believe, and I'm sure that this will be one matter discussed with our friend regulators, that regulation at least should be, since we are in Europe, on a European level. That does not mean that there should not be French regulation, but at one point, the target, in our view, should be European regulation. And then to quickly conclude, basically 3 main issues to be addressed. One, as I said, investor protection. And we believe that, at least in the first range, maybe it would be a good idea to deal with and to comply with MiFID II, meaning the so-called professionals, or in French, les contreparties éligibles. 2, as I said, just whatever the token, whether it is financial security or non-financial, just to enforce everything that relates to anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism financing. And 3, last but not the least, ensure also that there is a good consistency between the existing property and ownership right regulation and the token or the coins. In other terms, how does that fit? And we all know that blockchain technology is moving, but at one point, how can we ensure then when you buy a token or buy a coin, and then when it goes through the blockchain or various blockchain, in particular, if it's a private blockchain, how can you be sure that it still belongs to you, at least according to the traditional and existing ownership right regulation?
Thank you very, very much for this very comprehensive tour of the situation. Mr. Van de Ven, I think the AFM has conducted a study on investors' perception of ICOs. What are the main findings? How does the AFM see this whole issue, and perhaps start answering the question of why should we regulate ICOs? So at least in the Dutch view.
Thank you. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here, especially such a wonderful city as Paris. Certainly, given the weather outside. But for the moment, let me talk you a bit through what we did in the Netherlands. Actually, we differentiated between the use of cryptos and the use of ICOs. I will touch upon that later, but that's a really big difference in our opinion. And actually, in the Netherlands, there were some general studies about how many people were using cryptos, but we wanted a bit more granular approach. So we start asking people, well, how many cryptos do you use? What are the risks, etc. And we were mainly worried about You know, there was a really big hype last year, beginning of this year as well, as everybody probably knows, and we were really worried that people were borrowing money, investing in cryptos, or actually, we say it's more speculating than actually investing. But actually what we found was quite the contradictory, because people in the Netherlands at least are quite conservative investing in cryptos. 70% of the people we surveyed, and there were 600,000 people in the Netherlands actually were investing or speculating with cryptos. But actually 70% of them did that with less than 1,000 euros. And more importantly, actually they only 2% borrowed money to do that. And even more importantly, only 1% of that, so quite a small percentage, has a really big problem once the market crashes, like we saw in February, March this year. Also, we found out that consumers are generally quite aware of the risks, maybe also because we warned several times last year about investing in cryptocurrencies, and 80% of those consumers actually was aware of our warnings. And actually that's also quite reassuring from a regulator's point of view, given the fact that the average crypto investor has no previous experience with investing in traditional asset classes, like stocks or bonds. So imagine people, average investors, also quite young, starting to invest in cryptos, no other investment experience, and then using cryptos as a first start. Well, it's a really big roller coaster, and you need to have some quite nerves of steel, actually. But that's considering cryptos. Then considering ICOs, we found out that only 10%, so quite a small percentage, invested in ICOs. And their main motive was belief in the company, while the main motive for people investing in cryptos was actually more fear of missing out. So they were afraid to miss the boat, and given the fact that others were making money quite easily, they wanted to get in. Given ICOs, the story is different. People really believed in the company. And actually, they also did quite their own due diligence, not only reading the obvious white papers, but also checking, 30% also checks the online and the social media accounts of ICO investors, of issuers. Well, that's not always a proxy for a good result, but I think it's very, especially in a world full of scams and where digital fraud is committed very easily, it's a good thing to do. Considering regulation, people are also quite split. 30% was actually in favor of a regulation of ICOs, but 42% said, well, don't regulate it. But most striking, considering ICOs, I stress again, is that 75% of all ICO investors actually assess the risk of losing their complete investment as less than 50%, so 50%. Well, actually, this does not correspond with reality, because multiple external analyses show that 50 to even 80% of all ICOs conducted last year can be considered dead, either because it's a complete scam or because, you know, the project just went silent. And I think that's, you know, that's really summarizing for us or highlighting for us the problem here. And like Gilles also told in his introduction, well, you're selling something, but what are you actually selling? You're selling an ID. And especially when there's such a big hype going on, people are just blinded for the risk. And this actually creates a very big issue on the side of the investor, because how can you trust somebody you don't know? How can you even know if, you know, the identities that are being posted in such a white paper are the real identities? I mean, at the moment, it's so easy just to scam people, and that's what worrying us. I mean, yes, there are very good ICOs. I think blockchain technology also enables better investor protection, could even leverage better investor protection, but it's not happening at the moment. So if we look at ICOs, at the moment, the mechanism as such is quite promising. I mean, it does provide a viable alternative for financing, but the way it's being used now is quite, or actually deeply worrying at the moment. That's also why we advise in the Netherlands consumers against investing in ICOs, and we'll touch upon that later. But the question here is, how do you regulate it then? And for us, the main point here is that if you're going to say, well, you know, all ICOs should be considered securities, or a big part should be considered securities, then you have to ask yourself, are you really addressing also with those regulations the root causes? So the fact that it's so easy to scam people or to defraud investors, is that solved by bringing this under financial regulation? And then if the question is no, then actually you're legitimizing a market which is still very nascent, where still lots of issues are happening. And actually then you're saying, well, this is comparable to traditional instruments like stocks or bonds. So you can safely invest in this, and this actually gives people a false sense of security. So it could backfire greatly. Therefore, we should be very cautious about regulating ICOs as financial, or the tokens in ICOs as financial instruments. I think we'll touch upon that later on.
Thank you very much. We will indeed. We will come back on the how we should regulate ICOs in a few minutes. Let's turn to the French regulator now. Benoit, AMF has done also a lot of work on ICOs, consultations, meeting project promoters. What has the AMF learned by doing this process? And what's the view of AMF on this particular topic? And perhaps more precise question, can tokens be considered as financial instruments?
Yeah, thanks, Thierry. Good but very delicate question. So what did we learn at the AMF in the last, I would say, 18 months? I have to say that I speak under the control of the fintech team. This fintech team is seated there in the middle of the audience, and this team, if you want, we will discuss with them at the end of the meeting, but they met in 18 months approximately 50 different project initiators. I wouldn't describe all these projects, one of them being Gilles Fedac, but only one of them, because all other were very different, very heterogeneous projects, and it's very difficult to summarize the kind of project that we met. The only thing that I have to say is maybe that people or project initiators who spontaneously decided to meet this team, most of them, I would say, are not pure fraudsters. But of course, there are a lot of fraudsters, and as a regulator, we publish a lot of warnings and so on, which is absolutely necessary. So to summarize very quickly these 50 different projects, most of these projects aim to create a marketplace in their own sector. Some use blockchain technology, but the majority of them don't use blockchain technology, and they are active in a very diversified and wide range of economic sector. So to go on and to try to answer to the very delicate question that Thierry asked me regarding the legal qualification. As maybe you know, we published a large public consultation at the end of last year. We published the results of this consultation last February. Everything is on our website in French or in English, as you want. And so we have this debate regarding the legal qualification. It's not easy, I would say, and after also discussions around regulator, the only thing we agree on is to say it has to be a case-by-case basis. You have to take into account the substance of the form, because it's very diversified projects and it's a very delicate question, taking into account, of course, the current regulation. We have, in fact, preferred to summarize the tokens that we see in 3 categories, but already in the former one table, or Mr. Rousseau also has tried to summarize these tokens. Most tokens, or most ICO initiators that we met, I think could be classified as utility tokens. It means that the most important of this token is the ability to use or purchase some goods and services that the issuer is developing. So we don't think that they fall under the classification of financial instruments. The second category looks like cryptocurrency. It's more an alternative to traditional currencies. Of course, it's not legally a currency, and of course, it's not legally a financial instrument. And the third one, for us, it's clearly a small minority, look like financial instruments and could be classified so as a financial instrument. But the problem is that you have a legal definition of financial instruments, which is slightly changed with MiFID II regulation. The new prospectus regulation also refers to this appendix of MiFID II regulation. And this regulation, and legally it's rather vague regulation. The problem is it has tokens are there to fall into class of securities which are negotiable of the national market, on the capital market, with the exception of instruments of payment and so on. So it's difficult for us to clarify it. And what is more difficult, I try to summarize ICO between three categories, but in reality, all tokens are partly one of them and partly another one, and so on. So it's a mixture of these different categories, and so it's more, I would say, more delicate to classify them. Having said that, at the end, we think that most tokens that you have to analyze do not fall into this category of transferable security and financial instrument. I have also to mention that some of them get some kinds of government rights, others don't give this kind of rights. It's also a different element of appreciation that you have to take into account. But having said that, what is necessary to do if it's most of them do not fall into this category? The first thing I would say at the end, maybe ESMA one day will publish a paper which tries to clarify what kind of tokens could be fall into this category. But at the end, it's the courts who will decide, according to the current regulation, if a token is a financial instrument or not. And for us, it's not very comfortable to see all these tokens, all these project initiators, and not being able to give them very precise, sorry, but it's the reality to give you very precise legal answers.
Thank you very much. Perhaps we can now go a bit deeper into the how we should be regulating ICOs. And it seems to me that we have two slightly different approaches between the Dutch and the French regulator. And my point is not to emphasize differences, but to think together. I think this is also new, that we all need to think together about, the best approach. Mr. Van de Ven, if I heard you well, you use words like, full sense of security that could come with a regulator sort of authorizing an ICO. And you even said that you recommended not to invest in ICOs because you thought it was very dangerous. And obviously, I will ask Benoit to summarize the approach of AMF as to how it could be regulated. And I think, obviously, the question behind, we have the Dutch and the French, but this is the European Union. And, should we have a regulation at EU level? Does it make sense to regulate at national level? In a world where, well, that is, sorry for stating the obvious, global, and in particular with this technology. So, Mr. Van de Ven, do you want to start on this?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think from our Dutch point of view, we're in favor of a more international framework. But the question here is, what time will it take in order to achieve that? Next to that, also, it's for the AMF, but I think also the SEC, the other big international regulators, it's a challenge. So what approach is most sensible, is most balanced, is something we need to find out. So although I'm in favor of an international achieved framework, it doesn't permit national authorities, to experiment or explore different types of legislation. And for us, the point is, and I think there we definitely concur. We have the same position as the AMF, that you really have to look at a comprehensive solution. If you're talking about, well, okay, certain parts will be included on the financial regulation, on the MiFID, then you actually also exclude other parts automatically. So the question then is what to do with the other parts. And I think you have to look at the activity as such, instead of what's the mere function of the tokens, although those two do have some links. But what we're seeing here is actually raising capital. So people have an idea, more or less, well, not as professional as the regulated market, I should say. and they want to raise money for that idea. Then the question is, what kind of root causes or root problems are can occur there or are occurring there, which need to be addressed? And then the question is, should you do that by bringing this all under financial regulations? Well, then, like I said, we have the issue that actually you should really address the root causes, or should you maybe work towards a more bespoke framework, like, for example, happened with crowdfunding as well a couple of years ago. And then actually, and I think that's also a nice comparison, crowdfunding, you know, a couple of years ago, it would totally replace venture capitalists. It was the new way, it was nice, it was sexy, everybody was talking about it. And if you're looking at crowdfunding now, actually it's not as big, at least, as we anticipated it to be. So the question is, are you then now if you're now looking at ICOs in the current circumstances, yes, there are issues that need to be addressed, but also we're still in a hype, I would say. And if this hype subsides, what will be then left of, you know, this activity of raising money through issuing tokens? So I think a proportionate, talking in more broader terms, I think a proportionate, balanced approach is needed, and it should be principle based. So we shouldn't write everything down in rules, but it should be more principle based, and that's the way actually we try to regulate or supervise companies in the Netherlands as well. So there should be also some room left for companies to fill in those principles, instead of, and that's actually also making it easier to achieve such a framework, instead of, you know, laying down rule by rule what needs to be achieved or what needs to be done. And in that sense, I think most important, if you look at the real, you know, root causes, in our opinion, is you know, there needs to be much more governance, there needs to be much more responsibility on the side of the ICO issuer. So you should develop a certain duty of care of the issuer towards its investors, because now, actually, without any regulation, you raise money, you raise millions. The question is, why do you need those millions for? And then, actually, there are no contractual obligations. So what's then left of the position of the investor? That should be addressed, but not only by, you know, making, you know, really hard rules, but also having a bit more of a duty of care. So the issuer should act in the best interest of the investor.
Many thanks. Benoit, what's the French regulator's view on how to strike the right balance between fostering innovation and protecting investors?
Yes, delicate questions once again. But to begin exactly like Lars, I would say that we would prefer an international approach, but take into account the length of time which is necessary at the international level to achieve a common regulation. We thought that it was more appropriate to begin at a national level, having in mind that, exactly like Lars said regarding crowdfunding, in the coming years, maybe a kind of European regulation could take place. But in the meantime, what is necessary to do? If we do nothing, once again, I think that regarding the definition of financial instruments, most IPO would have no regulation. So as a consequence, we thought appropriate to propose to the French government, and that's what was published at the end of the public consultation I referred to last February, we thought appropriate to put in place a specific national regulatory approach regarding these IPOs. We think it's very important that it could be opt-in, facultative, framework. I mean that a mandatory one at the national level, for our perspective, is not appropriate, because it will be the main reason is too easy to circumvent. So our goal is to try to attract good projects, the best ones, if I could say that, at least to avoid as far as possible all the fosters of scams that could arise in the market, and to propose to the other ICO initiator to exactly taking into account also a lot of information which are already included in the white paper that they published, to say, okay, we will put in our regulation the possibility that if you give relevant information on a lot of issues, you could have a kind of stamp of approval by the national authority. What kind of information would be relevant? A lot of them, I would say. For instance, a clear identification of the legal entity used as issuer, relevant information of the project, of the technology, and of course, all the risks included, relevant information of the token itself and the rights associated with the token, information of the price of the issued token, of the way the price will be calculated or determined, information on related party, on tokens already issued, the way the subscription are dealt with, use of an escrow account upon completion, treatment of other subscription, of course, identification of every investors to put in place the KYC and anti-money laundering due diligences, and also custodial arrangements. It's not a limited list, but I would say that if this project will come into force, it will be so necessary that at least all this information could be published, and I would say checked by the French AMF. On top of that, last subject, which is maybe still a more delicate one, is the question of the secondary market. Of course, is an ICO initiator intend to give investors the possibility to trade these tokens on a secondary market, it will have to mention and to describe the secondary market very completely in the ICO offering memorandum. But on top of that, we saw a lot of criticism regarding the way these secondary markets currently are working. Volatility, a huge volatility, very opaque functioning, hidden costs, lack of transparency, and so on. That's the reason why we are also working for the time being on the possibility to create a kind of legal status to this kind of exchange of platform, which will on which the ICO could be exchanged. Of course, some rules. If we intend to create this kind of legal status, you will have also the debate: is it a mandatory or opt-in? I would once again be more in favor of opt-in status, but it's also debatable. And of course, the rules associated to it. Some of the rules, not all, but some of the rules would be the same as the rules which are currently applied to the regulated trading venues.
Many thanks. Let's turn now to the two practitioners, the startup and the large institution, to react to what the regulators just said, and perhaps in particular on the topic of secondary markets. Obviously, if you're doing an ICO, you need to have a market after the ICO. Otherwise, what does it mean? And Benoît Juvigny just gave us a view on this. Mr. Fedak, I mean, do the tokens issued by iExec actually trade on a market, on several markets? What's your view on that? Is that important or not for you as the issuing company? And you feel that the way it's happening today on your tokens is satisfactory, or should it be done in a different way? Should it be regulated? Should it be done better?
Yes, this question of the secondary market is becoming more and more important. It's emerging as one of the key issues we have to solve as soon as possible. So at the moment, to answer your question about the RLC token, it's listed on maybe a dozen platforms. Some of them are almost insignificant. Some of them are quite strong. So to give you an idea, I think that at the moment the market cap is around $120 million. The volume is at least $2 million per 24 hours. It's tradable every day, every hour, without any interruption. We are listed on several exchanges around the world. So one is Korean. Bittrex, I think, is US. No, Bittrex is US. Bitfinex is US also. Binance was Chinese, then it was in between Singapore and Japan, and at the end, I think they landed in Malta. So it's the question of those exchange places. So yeah, the question of these exchange places is very important. It's not always very clear. It has a lot of practical. So first, there are very good things about that. The good thing for the token holders is that there's a lot of liquidity. I mean, if I compare this, so a couple of days ago, we had talks with people from Euronext. So it gave me the opportunity to look at, how the stock market in France is going. I was not especially aware of that. And in terms of liquidity, in terms of people, they can do arbitrage. I mean, with our token, people can very easily do arbitrage between different places. They can hold, they can store their tokens. That's something really important. You can store your tokens on a wallet. You can send that to a friend. You can split the tokens in several parts. You can also spend the token, not necessarily, you don't necessarily have to go to a secondary market to change that against fiat. You can also have credit card where you pay your restaurant bill in euro, and this will on the fly convert the tokens in fiat somewhere. So there is really a user experience with the token that is very different than the traditional stock, and that's something that people should also understand. There are a lot of practical issues with the stock exchange, especially when you are a startup. And you have to manage a lot of assets in cryptocurrencies. One of them is, for instance, the issue with accountability. So at the moment, for instance, when I sell my bitcoins against euro, I have no document, nothing, that is good enough for good practice that we should have. And so, for instance, this is really an issue. The accountant is not super happy with the document. I can present him. And so this is a problem that we have, in particular in EU, in France, of course, and in EU. At the moment, I don't think that there are good exchange places in the EU. I can't think of. Some of them are in UK at best. Most of them are in the US. And many of them were Chinese and are now in sort of...
May I ask what you mean by good exchange? What does good mean?
Well, there is volatility when you have to... it's difficult to sell big volumes of...
so liquidity.
Liquidity. You can do OTC, but the only time I was about to do a UTC trade, the guys asked me, it's a very famous exchange, I would not give its name, but they are considered serious people. The guy asked me for my RIB, what's the name for RIB?
Yeah, your
ID, the account number.
Bank
and then I was
number.
supposed to receive millions from I don't know where. So I don't know way.
do you have an explanation of why European exchanges, I won't call them stock exchanges because it's not stocks, but exchanges are, provide less liquidity than American or Asian exchanges?
So practically in France, right now, it's just impossible to run an exchange. And mainly, I'm sorry to say that, but because of the bank.
We're here to think together.
The banks. We had a discussion with one of the first actor in France in this sector, and he had 4 times his bank account closed. So that's the reason why, number one.
Okay, so that leads us to the banker. What's the bank's view on secondary markets, liquidity, and the issues we just discussed?
And regulation, generally speaking. And well, I'll come back to your point eventually. Well, two preliminary remarks. One, because, as we said, there is a huge diversity in terms of coins, tokens, and so on, our feeling is that, for one time, one size does not fit all. It does not fit all. So there should be various regulations, with one exception, and the one exception is basically anti-money laundering and anti-financing terrorism. And basically, with that respect, we are just wondering what, in terms of AML, ATF regulation, how does it apply to utility tokens, jetons d'usage, which are not really financial, and incidentally, with respect to the existing force directive at European level, anti-money laundering, and the fifth, which is in preparation, who will be the designated supervisor to enforce these regulations, and in particular to enforce them when it comes to non-financial tokens. You'll tell me it's not a real concern for banks, but at one point, as we know, there could be a connection. These two remarks are being done. We believe that in terms of regulations, there are basically three main issues which have to be assigned. One, I'll just mention that with two remarks. It's regulating not only secondary market, but more generally speaking, platforms, and in particular, platform for emitting tokens. And with that respect, two remarks. One, we feel there is a need for regulation, but we don't feel that it should be a cut and paste of existing regulation when it comes to secondary market, because there are some specificities linked to coins and tokens which makes them different from the existing markets. First remark. Second remark, and it comes to one of your points, which I believe is a major one, is how does that interconnect? How does that fit with the existing secondary markets? And then we are talking of securities secondary market. And then we believe that there should be bridges and coordination between the two, because at one point, even non-financial tokens might become somewhere financial, and even financial tokens which are not considered today as securities will become securities. So there should be a bridge between the two in terms of regulation. So two other issues, one are major two. One is tax, because we can hardly believe that given the current position of public finance, government, and so on, whether at French, European, or even international level, today it's more or less a taxless sector in terms of, you know.
There was a recent decision by Conseil d'État on this particular topic. Yeah.
You know, how do you apply the flat tax, the famous flat tax, if you own tokens? How does that, you know, work from a tax perspective? That's the first thing. The third point, excuse me, which is also major, is, and it's not only financial, meaning it does not exclusively relate to the banking and financial sector, is how do you manage that from an accounting standpoint? In other terms, if you have tokens, how do they appear in your balance sheet? How do they appear in your profit and loss? As we have seen in the US, SEC considers this could be securities. CFTC in the US consider they could be commodities. And you know, more generally speaking, how do you consider fair value for tokens, and how do you put that in your books, whether P&L or balance sheet? Maybe, if I may, regarding opening accounts for platforms, the answer is very simple. We are not at ease at all with Bitcoin, with Ethereum, and so on. And if it comes at one point to get some, let's say, fiat currencies out of tokens, you have to go through these intermediates. To date, we don't want to do it.
Many issues. We don't have time to get deep into the issue, but on the tax issue, it has started being treated, you know, and Conseil d'État has actually taken the task of doing this. If we go back to regulators' friends, I have a question for you. what does it mean to regulate a Dutch ICO or French ICO, or if you were a Swiss or American, an American ICO or a Swiss ICO? You understood me. And what's behind my question is obviously two things. First of all, the technology is global, doesn't seem to really know borders, unless I'm missing something. And the other thing is we see very, very, very different positions from different regulators in the world, from the Swiss, who seem to be very sympathetic to ICOs, to some regulators who forbid them altogether. So is it not a case where if one regulator in the world says this is fine, the whole world, you know, will take ICOs because it will be regulated or non-regulated there, and then it goes everywhere? Or am I missing something? Is it the right way to think about this? What's, you know, and obviously, when it comes to IPOs, nationality is, okay, you want to be listed on the Dutch stock exchange, on the French stock exchange, therefore, you know, Dutch or French regulators step in. But, you know, there's no such thing as a Dutch token exchange.
Well, just to kick off, actually the question is what kind of regulator is saying this is okay? If it's the SEC, then I think you can distribute it worldwide, except China maybe and South Korea still at the moment. But if you're saying it's the AFM and then you're selling it in the US, then the SEC will say, well, it doesn't matter. It's we're seeing it as a security. I don't know the AFM actually, so I mean that's a bit. I mean, I understand the background of your question, but actually, if I look at the Dutch perspective, in the Netherlands, we're not regulating ICOs unless they can be considered a security. And actually, what we find quite interesting, and that's something we want to explore more, is securitized token offerings. So not offering tokens that can be considered securities, but securities that are tokenized. And I think this has real value in, you know, applying blockchain technology in for the current infrastructure. And that's something we're quite open to explore. And then you have the question, for example, if you use a private blockchain, it's much easier because you don't need cryptos for it in most part. But actually, the challenging part here is then, what if you're using the Ethereum platform, for example, to list your securities on? Then you need Ether or gas in order to transact or to process those securities, or to process transactions. And then the question is, well, to what extent do we want to allow such experiments? But I think for us it's quite interesting to see, to see something like, for example, Ethereum. There are much other platform-like cryptos that actually provide an additional infrastructure upon the internet, current internet infrastructure, and that's something very interesting to explore. If then you're using privacy coins like Monero, for example, then we see all kinds of issues with AML and terrorist financing. That's something we're not open to. And the more room there is for functional use of those tokens, of those platforms, the more we can also explore to what extent it fits within the current financial regulatory framework, and where we can have, you know, more flexibility, or where we should be very strict. But at the moment, and that's coming back to my first point, as long as there's speculation and criminal use of those, as long as those are the real use cases, then for us as a regulator, we cannot say, okay, we're open to those kinds of experiments.
Thank you. Benoit, would you have a similar answer, or would you put nuances or have a different view?
I would have quite the same answers, but the first and the best answer to this question is that we have to favor an international approach and an international regulation. In an optimal world, of course, it would be necessary, and at least I think that an European regulation one day would be very necessary. To come back to our project in France, what we have in mind, once again, it's only an opt-in regulation, but it will be open only to French registered companies, maybe to some extent to other companies which clearly target French audience. I don't know. It's debated for the time being. And having said that, this kind of project, of course, will be open to the French investors, and abroad it will depend on the local regulation and also on the credibility, I agree with Lars, on the stamp of approval given by French AMF.
Thank you. Time is running, unfortunately. We could spend 3 hours discussing this. I think this is time to open questions to the floor before we hear the final remarks from our president. There are microphones running in the room.
Yes.
Gentleman there?
There's someone.
Sorry. If you can present yourself and make short questions, please.
Yeah,
Short and specific
Jean-François
questions.
Bay, financière de l'échiquier. I have a question for regulators which try to reconcile ICOs and traditional financial instruments. I don't know if you investigate, analyze a SPAC format. SPAC means special purpose certificate used in the US to finance projects, and certificates are listed on stock exchange. Thank you.
I propose we take 3 questions, or 2-3 questions, and we'll try to answer together.
Hello, here. Abdullah Sadi from Amplogest. I have a question that is not directly linked to ICOs or blockchain, but the answer can be: how would you react, how the regulators will react if the VC capital was open to everyone? And there was a huge inflow of capital going to VCs. How would you regulate that? And if there is a regulation, I think that you can apply the same for ICOs because we can see them as VCs.
Okay. I think I've seen 2 other hands raising. One there. And there's, gentleman there who has a microphone already, and you'll be the last one.
Okay, I have a specific question for Mr.
Can you present yourself, please?
Yes, I'm a lawyer at the Paris Bar.
Okay.
I have just one question for Mr. Rousseau here. We touched on that topic. For ICO projects, it's very difficult to open bank accounts. And once the funds are raised, it's very difficult then to bring back this, the fiat currency into bank accounts. I would just like to know why this position, how you want to tackle this issue in the future, and because it really seems from the ecosystem point of view that the banks are doing this to avoid being disrupted.
I feel we have a debate there. Sir?
Christophe Boudric, Zagis. I usually do regular audit, on-site audit of startup who are starting ICO in order to give confidence to people who want to spare money or to give money to the ICO. And one question is for the regulator is once you have the stamp of agreement of the visa given by AMF, is there another obligation and other gate of control during the ICO, or only one gate, which is the first?
Thank you. We answered the 4 questions. So the first one was for the regulators on SPAC. Do you have an answer for this?
A general answer: no, we didn't look at it. But then, the real question: I think in the US they have a more aggressive strategy, if I might say, towards ICO. So actually, I think the chairman there has said, well, every token or every ICO is a security. I don't know. I mean, we have a different approach, as you may have heard from last couple of minutes. So at the moment, we don't look at it, to be short.
Yeah, maybe I will try to open your question, because due to financial engineering, it's very easy to put in place, I would say, SPAC, for instance, but also any kind of derivatives, including tokens or bitcoins and so on. So the question for us, we focus this one table on ICO and token precisely, but we know that the question also in the financial world was for many other means which are available. And I would say that we have now the question regarding, for instance, eligibility of this kind of financial instrument. For instance, a derivative is obviously a financial instrument, and an equity invested in a SPAC would be also qualified as financial instruments. I don't know how legally, I would say, according to the accountability, I'm not so sure that it will work well, but so it's another question. And so the question for us is regarding this new kind of financial instruments, what are the eligibility rules? For instance, in asset management products, we already have this kind of questions. And so we could discuss of that. And for us, it's very complicated questions, especially taking into account the current regulatory framework, which is not at all dealt with in this, having this kind of new products in mind.
The next question was a reaction, comparison with VC capital and regulation potential. I must say I'm not aware of such a regulation, but perhaps I'm missing something. If there was too much capital going to the VC industry, if I understood the question correctly.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would, because VC for me, private equity is not very, it's regulated, but I would say to a small degree.
Yeah, and in my understanding, if capital flows to VC, well, it's VC's problem, not a regulator's problem. But I don't know if you.
Yeah, so I think coming back to what we said earlier, I think we're seeing here the democratization of investing. So actually, everybody can be a VC right now. But then the question is, do you also have the capabilities to properly value all those projects you're investing in? Because, like we said, private equity has, I think, a high level of expertise or professionalism in dealing with startups or people with ideas and funding those. And if you look now at ICOs, actually everybody with a working internet connection and a digital wallet can participate in this level. I mean, they're not even, most of them are not even startups, they're even more in an embryonic phase. And then the question is, do consumers, retail consumers, really have the capabilities to properly value the propositions offered in an ICO? And actually, is the right information even available to do so? So I think, yes, everybody can be a VC right now, but the question is, does this have only merit, or is it also creates big risks also for the individual involved?
Yeah, this is clearly a very fundamental point. Next question was on the difficulty of opening bank accounts, Mr. Rousseau.
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to repeat myself. First of all, we are not against ICOs. We are against cryptocurrencies and things like Bitcoin or Ethereum. That's the first thing. The second thing is, as an ICO, as I said in introduction, I'm convinced we'll do some one day. First thing. Second thing is, we are clearly, strictly abiding by the current directives, fourth and soon fifth, regarding anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism financing, very strictly. And maybe it's not widely seen from outside, but from inside, I can tell you, you could not believe which is the current importance of compliance within banks, generally speaking, and within BNP Paribas in particular, because I'm sure you remember things which happened to us, even though we were strictly abiding by the French and the European laws in 2014. Extraterritoriality of the North American right. So we strictly abide by that. And it comes in terms of compliance to, as I said, we are not at ease when directly or indirectly some platforms use Bitcoins, Ethereum, or that kind of thing. For a very simple reason, because this kind of cryptocurrency, no one can guarantee that they're abiding by this directive and regulation. So we just don't want to do it. In terms of competition, believe me, we are dealing with fintech. Fintech can be competitors. Fintech are partners. I mean, we can live with that. And with respect to the new ICO platforms, they are currently, in that market. Will be one day in the market when things are more clear and more formalized. There will be competition. C'est la vie. But once again, I think you really should be convinced. I'm not sure I'm convincing, unfortunately, that the reason why we are handling today this position is really exclusively linked to compliance and abiding by anti-money laundering regulation, and that's it. And it's not trying to escape from competition. Once again, competition is there, competition will come, competition will be even stronger, but we'll manage, or we'll try.
The last point, perhaps, will be for Benoit, was on obligation gate, so to speak, beyond the possible visa.
No, what we have in mind regarding what I call a bespoke regulation is that behind the memorandum, the information memorandum, there is a legal entity. And this legal entity should be liable. All the information, all the engagement that would be in this memorandum of information should be respected. And if 1 year or 2 years later we see that, for instance, something is not done, we could sanction the legal entity according to what it said. That's the only thing that we have in mind. The other subject is what kind of secondary market and what kind of legal status related to the secondary market will be put in place. But it's another question.
Thank you very much. It's time to conclude this panel. I think I hope we helped explore the why, the how, and the where we should regulate. And it's time to give the floor to the chairman of Autorité des marchés financiers, Robert Ophel. Thank you very much.